Imagine a wind so powerful it saved an entire nation, not once, but twice. Think of a winter so cold it stopped one of the world's greatest armies in its tracks, its soldiers freezing where they stood. Picture a day's rain delaying a battle long enough to change the fate of Europe. A summer disappeared entirely, bringing snow in June and widespread famine. Weather forecasters held the success of the largest amphibious invasion in history in their hands. Sometimes the most powerful force shaping our world isn't a king or an army, but the sky itself. Number 10. The divine winds that twice smashed the Mongol fleets. In the late 13th century, Kublai Khan, the grandson of the fearsome Genghis Khan, commanded a vast and mighty empire. From his grand capital in China, he ruled over lands stretching across Asia. He had conquered China and Korea, and his gaze then fell upon Japan, an island nation he was determined to add to his sprawling domain. His first attempt to conquer Japan came in 1274. A massive fleet carrying tens of thousands of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean warriors set sail. These were seasoned soldiers, part of the Mongol war machine that had seemed unstoppable. They landed on Japanese shores and clashed with the samurai, Japan's legendary warriors. The fighting was fierce, the samurai resisting with all their might, but the Mongol numbers and tactics were formidable. Just as the invasion seemed to be gaining a dangerous foothold, the weather turned. A sudden, ferocious typhoon roared out of the Pacific. The Mongol fleet, caught unprepared and anchored in open bays, was devastated. Ships were tossed like toys, smashed against each other, and driven onto the unforgiving coastline. Thousands of invaders drowned, their dreams of conquest swallowed by the raging sea. The battered remnants of the Mongol force had no choice but to retreat. Kublai Khan was not a man to accept defeat easily. He was furious and more determined than ever. He spent years preparing for a second, even larger invasion. In 1281, an enormous armada, possibly the largest naval force the world had ever seen up to that point, set sail for Japan. Consisted of two separate fleets, one from China and one from Korea, with estimates suggesting around 4,400 ships and as many as 140,000 soldiers and sailors. The scale was breathtaking. For weeks, the Japanese defenders fought bravely, holding out against the invaders at coastal fortifications. The fate of Japan hung precariously in the balance. Then, once again, the heavens intervened. Another typhoon, even more powerful than the first, descended upon the Mongol fleet. For days, the storm raged. When it finally subsided, the sea was a horrifying vista of shattered ships, splintered wood, and countless bodies. The second, grander Mongol Armada had been utterly annihilated. Japan was saved. The Mongols, having lost two massive fleets and tens of thousands of men, never attempted to invade Japan again. The Japanese people believed these storms were sent by the gods to protect their land. They called them kamikaze, which means divine wind. This belief in divine protection became deeply woven into the fabric of Japanese national identity and culture for centuries. A samurai class who had led the defense continued to be the dominant force in Japanese society. The Mongol Empire, its expansion checked in the east, turned its considerable energies towards other parts of its vast territory. Number 9. The storms that wrecked the invincible Spanish Armada. The year was 1588. King Philip II of Spain was arguably the most powerful ruler in Europe. His empire stretched across the globe, fueled by the riches of the New World. He was a devout Catholic and saw Queen Elizabeth I of England, a Protestant, as a heretic and a dangerous enemy supporting rebellions in his Spanish Netherlands. So Philip decided on a grand plan: invade England, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism. He assembled a colossal fleet, the Grande Felicissima Armada, the great and most fortunate navy, often called the Invincible Armada. It consisted of around 130 ships, carrying 8,000 sailors and some 18,000 highly trained soldiers. The Armada's strategy was to sail up the English Channel, link up with a large Spanish army stationed in the Netherlands under the Duke of Parma, and then ferry these combined forces across the narrow strait to invade England. However, the English navy, though smaller, had faster, more maneuverable ships and skilled commanders like Sir Francis Drake. As the Armada sailed into the Channel, the English harassed it relentlessly. In a key engagement, the Battle of Gravelines, English fireships, old vessels set ablaze and sent drifting into the Spanish fleet, caused panic and broke the Armada's tight defensive crescent formation. The Spanish ships were damaged, and their ammunition ran low. With the prevailing winds making a return trip down the Channel impossible and the English fleet blocking their path, the Spanish commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, made a fateful decision. The only way back to Spain was to sail north, circumnavigating Scotland and Ireland, and then head south through the treacherous Atlantic. It was a long, dangerous, and unfamiliar route for the Spanish navigators. As the battered Armada sailed northwards, it encountered the true enemy it could not defeat: the weather. During late August and September, a series of ferocious storms swept in from the Atlantic. These were not ordinary gales. Some had hurricane-force winds. The Spanish ships, many already damaged from battle and having lost their heavy anchors during the panic at Gravelines, were vulnerable. They were battered by mountainous waves, driven off course, and smashed onto the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers drowned in the cold, violent seas. Those unfortunate enough to survive the shipwrecks and make it ashore in Ireland were often met with hostility. Many were killed by English garrisons or local Irish inhabitants who were themselves under English rule. Only a fraction of the Invincible Armada, perhaps 67 ships, many in terrible condition, managed to struggle back to Spanish ports. More than 15,000 men were lost. It was a catastrophic and humiliating defeat for Spain. England remained Protestant and independent, its sense of national identity and confidence soaring. English naval power began to rise, while Spain's period of European dominance started a slow, gradual decline. The story of the storm scattering the Armada became a powerful legend in England, seen as divine intervention that saved their nation. Number 8. The General Winter that froze Napoleon's Grand Army. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of much of continental Europe. His armies had conquered nation after nation. Tsar Alexander, the First of Russia, defied him, refusing to comply with Napoleon's continental blockade of Britain. So, Napoleon decided to teach the Tsar a lesson. He assembled the Grande Armée, an enormous invasion force of over 600,000 soldiers drawn from France and all its allied and subject states. It was the largest army Europe had ever witnessed. The invasion of Russia began in June 1812. Napoleon expected a swift campaign, a decisive battle, and a quick Russian surrender. The Russians, however, adopted a different strategy. They retreated deeper and deeper into the vast Russian interior, avoiding a full-scale confrontation whenever possible. Crucially, they employed a scorched earth policy. As they withdrew, they burned villages, crops, and anything that the advancing French army might use for supplies or shelter. Napoleon's army was being lured further from its supply bases. He did fight a major battle at Borodino, which was incredibly bloody. Napoleon claimed victory, but the Russian army retreated in good order, still intact. He pushed on, and eventually reached Moscow in September. Napoleon expected Tsar Alexander to sue for peace once the ancient capital fell. Instead, he found Moscow largely deserted. Soon after the French occupied it, fires broke out across the city, likely set by retreating Russians. Moscow burned for days, destroying much of what remained, including vital food and shelter. Napoleon waited in the smoldering ruins for 5 weeks, hoping for a peace offer that never came. His army was running low on supplies, and winter was approaching. In mid-October, with no surrender in sight, Napoleon finally ordered the retreat. It was too late. Winter descended upon Russia with unusual speed and ferocity. Temperatures plummeted to unimaginable lows, -20, -30, even -40 degrees Celsius. Blizzards howled, and icy winds cut through the soldiers' inadequate clothing. Rivers, crucial for crossing, would freeze, then partially thaw, then refreeze, becoming death traps. The effect on the Grande Armée was catastrophic. Soldiers suffered from severe frostbite, leading to countless amputations. Hypothermia claimed thousands. Men froze to death on the march, huddled around pitiful campfires, or even as they slept. Horses, essential for transporting supplies and artillery, died in their tens of thousands. Without horses, cannons were abandoned, and supply wagons couldn't move. Discipline crumbled. Starving, freezing soldiers were constantly harassed by Russian Cossacks and partisan fighters who picked off stragglers. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November became a notorious disaster, with thousands more perishing in the icy waters or on the crowded shelled bridges. Of the more than 600,000 men who had marched into Russia with such confidence, only a small, broken fraction staggered out. Some sources say as few as 10,000 to 20,000 were still in fighting condition, though perhaps up to 90,000 in total survived in various states of ruin. Napoleon's legendary Grande Armée was effectively destroyed. This disaster in Russia was a decisive turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. His enemies, emboldened, formed a new coalition against him. Napoleon's aura of invincibility was shattered. He managed to raise new armies, but they lacked the training and experience of the veterans lost to General Winter and the vast, unforgiving Russian landscape. Number 7. The mud that bogged down the Battle of Waterloo, June 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte, the once Emperor of France, had made a stunning return to power. He had escaped from his exile on the island of Elba, landed in France, and rallied the nation behind him for a period known as the 100 Days. The great powers of Europe, who had defeated him once, quickly formed another coalition to stop him for good. 2 main Allied armies stood in his way in Belgium, an Anglo-Allied force under the command of the Duke of Wellington, and a Prussian army led by the veteran Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. Napoleon, ever the master of swift action, moved quickly. He defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny on June 16th, forcing them to retreat. Wellington, to avoid being outflanked, pulled his army back to a strong defensive position along a ridge near the small village of Waterloo. Napoleon pursued, confident he could crush Wellington before the Prussians had a chance to recover and rejoin the fight. Then, the weather intervened. On the night of June 17th and into the early morning of June 18th, a violent thunderstorm erupted over the region. Torrential rain lashed down for hours, soaking the battlefield. When dawn broke on June 18th, the day of the expected battle, the ground was a sodden, muddy morass. Fields were churned into deep, sticky mud, making movement for soldiers, horses, and especially heavy artillery incredibly difficult. Napoleon was a brilliant artillery commander. His battle plans often relied on the devastating power of his cannons. He knew that in such wet conditions, his cannons would be hard to maneuver into position. Furthermore, cannonballs would be far less effective. Instead of bouncing across the ground causing multiple casualties, they would simply thud into the soft mud and bury themselves. So Napoleon made a crucial decision. He delayed the start of his attack. He waited for the ground to dry out, hoping for a few hours of sun and wind. Instead of beginning the battle in the early morning as was common, the French assault did not commence until around 11:30 a.m. Some sources even say closer to 1 p.m. This delay proved critical. Marshal Blucher, despite his defeat at Ligny and the arduous retreat, was determined to support Wellington. The extra hours Napoleon waited gave the Prussians precious time. They marched hard through difficult, muddy country, driven by Blucher's iron will. The Battle of Waterloo itself was a brutal, close-run affair. The French launched massive attacks against Wellington's lines, focusing on key strongpoints like the farmhouse of Hougoumont and the chateau of La Haye-Sainte. Enormous French cavalry charges thundered against the Allied infantry squares. Wellington's troops held on, but only just. Then, in the late afternoon, the first Prussian formations began to arrive on Napoleon's right flank. This forced Napoleon to divert vital troops, including units of his elite Imperial Guard, to hold off the Prussians. This weakened his main effort against Wellington at a critical moment. By evening, with the Prussians heavily engaged and Wellington's line holding firm, the French army broke. Napoleon was defeated. This was the final end of his reign. He was exiled once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. The map of Europe was redrawn at the Congress of Vienna, ushering in a long period of relative peace. Historians widely agree that the heavy rain and the resulting muddy conditions, by forcing Napoleon to delay his attack, gave Blucher's Prussians the time they needed to reach the battlefield and play a decisive role in the Allied victory. Number 6. The year there was no summer. It all began in April 1815, far away in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. Mount Tambora, a massive volcano, erupted with cataclysmic force. It was one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. The explosion was colossal, blowing the top off the mountain and spewing unimaginable quantities of volcanic ash rock and sulfur dioxide gas high into the Earth's stratosphere. These fine particles and sulfate aerosols then began to spread slowly around the globe, forming a veil that partially blocked sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface. The following year, 1816, became known as the Year Without a Summer. In North America and Europe, it was also chillingly referred to as the Poverty Year, or more anecdotally, 1800 and froze to death. Climatic effects were bizarre and devastating. In New England and Quebec, there was snowfall in June. Frosts occurred in July and August, killing off crops. Corn, a staple, failed almost completely. People were forced to eat raccoons, pigeons, and whatever else they could find. This agricultural disaster spurred a large wave of migration westward from New England, as families sought more fertile and climatically stable lands. Across the Atlantic, Europe suffered a similarly grim fate. The summer was unusually cold and relentlessly rainy. Rivers flooded, and crops failed spectacularly across Britain, Ireland, France, Germany, and Switzerland. Food prices skyrocketed, leading to widespread famine and desperate food riots in many towns and cities. Malnutrition weakened populations, making them susceptible to diseases like typhus, which spread in epidemic proportions. In Asia, the climatic disruption had equally severe consequences. The normal monsoon patterns in India were altered, causing widespread crop failures and famine there as well. It's believed that these conditions contributed to a new virulent strain of cholera that emerged in Bengal and subsequently spread across the globe in a series of pandemics over the following decades. China also experienced unusually cold temperatures and heavy rains, leading to failures of the rice crops and widespread hardship. The gloomy, persistent bad weather even left its mark on culture. Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, Godwin, later Mary Shelley, and John Polidori were famously vacationing by Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Stuck indoors for days on end by the incessant rain of that wet, ungenial summer, they decided to pass the time with a ghost story writing contest. It was during this period that Mary Shelley conceived the idea for her novel Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Lord Byron wrote his bleak poem, Darkness, inspired by the atmospheric conditions. John Polidori wrote The Vampire, a story that became a significant early influence on the vampire genre. There's even a theory that the widespread failure of oat crops, leading to a shortage of food for horses, spurred the German inventor Karl von Drais to create his Laufmaschine, or running machine, an early forerunner of the bicycle. The year without a summer was a period of immense suffering, death, and social upheaval across much of the northern hemisphere. It was a stark demonstration of how a single distant geological event could trigger global climate change with profound and far-reaching consequences for human societies. Only later did scientists fully understand the connection between the Tambora eruption and the bizarre destructive weather of 1816. Number 5. The forecast that launched. D-Day, June 1944. The fate of Europe hung in the balance. Allied forces, primarily American, British, and Canadian, were poised to launch Operation Overlord, the massive amphibious invasion of Nazi-occupied France. This was to be the largest seaborne invasion in history, a monumental undertaking commanded by U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. Success was far from guaranteed, and one of the most unpredictable and crucial factors was the weather. For the D-Day landings to have any chance of success, a very specific set of conditions was required. They needed a low tide around dawn to expose German beach obstacles. They needed a nearly full moon on the preceding night for paratroopers landing behind enemy lines and for naval visibility. They needed relatively calm seas for the thousands of landing craft, many of them small and vulnerable. They needed light winds. And they needed reasonably good visibility, without low cloud cover, for the supporting air power to bomb targets and for naval guns to accurately shell German defenses. These precise tidal and lunar conditions only occurred for a few days each month. The initial date chosen for the invasion was June 5, 1944. However, as late May and early June arrived, the weather in the English Channel turned exceptionally bad. A series of storms rolled in, bringing high winds, rough seas, and low cloud cover, conditions entirely unsuitable for an invasion. The pressure on the Allied meteorologists was immense. A team of British and American forecasters, headed by Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force, worked around the clock, analyzing conflicting weather models. On June 3rd, with the invasion fleet already beginning to assemble and some ships at sea, the forecast for June 5th was dire. Stagg and his team advised Eisenhower the conditions would be impossible. Reluctantly, Eisenhower postponed the invasion by 24 hours. On the evening of June 4th, Eisenhower met again with his commanders and Stagg. The weather was still terrible. However, Stagg delivered a momentous forecast. He predicted a narrow window of improved weather, a temporary break in the storms starting late on June 5th and lasting through June 6th. It was a risky prediction, as some other forecasters were less optimistic, and the signs were not clear-cut. Eisenhower faced an agonizing decision. Postponing again would mean a delay of at least 2 weeks, until the next period of suitable tides and moonlight. Such a delay would be a logistical nightmare, potentially compromising the secrecy of the operation and damaging the morale of the hundreds of thousands of men waiting to go. After intense discussion, weighing the risks, Eisenhower famously said, "Okay, we'll go." On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the weather was far from perfect, but it was manageable, just as Stagg had predicted. The seas were still choppy, causing seasickness and making some landings difficult. Cloud cover did hamper some air operations. However, the critical window held. Interestingly, German weather forecasters, relying on different data, had predicted that the bad weather would continue. They advised their commanders that an Allied invasion in early June was highly unlikely. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the German commander responsible for defending Normandy, was so confident of this that he had even left France to travel to Germany for his wife's birthday. If the Allies had attempted to land on June 5th as originally planned, the fleet could have been scattered and wrecked by the storm. If they had postponed for several weeks, historical weather records show they might have encountered even worse conditions that occurred later in June, or the element of surprise would have been lost, and German defenses could have been strengthened. The D-Day landings were successful, though they came at a high cost in human lives. A vital foothold was established in Western Europe, which ultimately led to the liberation of France and the defeat of Nazi Germany. The daring and remarkably accurate weather forecast provided by James Stagg and his team was an absolutely critical, though often overlooked element in this pivotal moment of World War II. Number 4. The Great Hurricane that hammered the American Revolution. The year 1780 was a crucial period in the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. American patriot forces were locked in a bitter struggle for independence against Great Britain. France and Spain, eager to weaken their common enemy, Britain, had allied with the Americans. A significant theater of this global conflict was the Caribbean, a region prized for its lucrative sugar plantations and strategic naval bases. Both Britain and France maintained powerful fleets there, vying for control of the islands and sea lanes. In October 1780, this already volatile situation was catastrophically impacted by a weather event of almost unimaginable ferocity, the Great Hurricane of 1780. It struck the Lesser Antilles chain of islands between October 10th and October 16th and is considered one of the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes ever recorded. While precise meteorological measurements from that era are unavailable, modern analysis suggests it was an incredibly powerful storm, possibly reaching sustained wind speeds of over 200 miles per hour. The devastation it wrought across the Caribbean islands was apocalyptic. Barbados was reported to be almost completely flattened. Thousands of its inhabitants perished. Trees were stripped bare, and buildings were obliterated. On the French island of Martinique, a massive disaster befell a French transport fleet. 40 ships, carrying around 4,000 soldiers destined for an attack on a British-held island, were caught by the hurricane and utterly wrecked. The vast majority of these soldiers drowned. On St. Lucia, numerous British warships at anchor were destroyed or severely damaged. The Dutch island of St. Eustatius, a vital neutral trading hub that supplied goods to all sides, was also devastated, with many ships in its harbor sunk. Other islands, including Grenada, Dominica, and St. Vincent, suffered immense destruction and loss of life. The naval forces of both Britain and France suffered grievously. The British Royal Navy lost many warships, including HMS Stirling Castle, HMS Phoenix, and HMS Andromeda, along with thousands of experienced sailors. Admiral George Rodney's fleet, a cornerstone of British naval power in the region, was severely battered. The French fleet, based in Martinique, already reeling from the loss of its troop transports, was also crippled. Across the affected islands, the total death toll from the Great Hurricane is estimated to be between 20,000 and 27,500 people, making it the single deadliest hurricane in Atlantic history. The storm had a significant, though complex, impact on the ongoing American Revolutionary War. It drastically weakened the naval capabilities of both the British and the French in the Caribbean theater for a considerable period. Critical warships were lost, along with irreplaceable skilled crews. Resources that would have been used for war efforts had to be diverted to emergency relief, salvage operations, and the long process of rebuilding. While both sides were affected, the loss of the 4,000 French soldiers and their transports at Martinique was a particularly severe blow, disrupting French military plans in the Caribbean at a critical juncture of the war. The broader conflict continued, of course, but the focus and capabilities of naval operations in the Caribbean were temporarily but significantly altered. For example, Britain had to redirect some ships that had been intended for service in North American waters to deal with the aftermath in the Caribbean, influencing naval deployments elsewhere. Number 3. The dust that blew away the American dream. The 1930s were a harsh time in the United States. The nation was already reeling from the Great Depression, a period of severe economic hardship. But for people living on the Great Plains, in states like Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, another catastrophe was unfolding: the Dust Bowl. This environmental disaster had several human and natural causes. For decades, settlers had been encouraged to farm the Great Plains. They plowed up millions of acres of native prairie grasses, which had deep root systems that naturally held the soil together and retained moisture. These lands were planted with wheat and other crops. During World War I, high grain prices encouraged even more intensive farming. After the war, prices fell, and farmers tried to compensate by plowing and planting even more land. Then, in the early 1930s, a severe and prolonged drought began. Rainfall across the plains dropped dramatically year after year. With the protective grasses gone and the land parched by drought, the exposed topsoil dried out and turned to fine dust. The strong winds that frequently sweep across the open prairies then picked up this loose soil, creating terrifying dust storms, often called black blizzards. These were not just hazy days. They were colossal walls of dust, sometimes thousands of feet high, that would roll across the landscape like dark, angry monsters. They blotted out the sun, sometimes for days at a time, plunging everything into an eerie, choking darkness. Fine dust seeped into every crack and crevice of homes, covering furniture, food, and bedding. It filled people's lungs. One of the most infamous of these storms occurred on April 14, 1935, a day known as Black Sunday, which caused immense damage and widespread fear. The impact on the people and the land was devastating. Dust pneumonia and other serious respiratory illnesses became common, especially among children and the elderly. Agriculture, the backbone of the plains economy, collapsed. Crops failed repeatedly. Livestock choked on the dust or starved because their grazing lands were buried or barren. The land itself became infertile, with valuable topsoil blown hundreds, even thousands of miles away. Many farms were simply buried under drifts of dust. Facing economic ruin, countless farmers lost their land to banks through foreclosure. This led to a massive human migration. Hundreds of thousands of people, often disparagingly called Okies, though they came from many Dust Bowl states, not just Oklahoma, were forced to abandon their homes and farms. They packed their few remaining belongings into dilapidated cars and trucks and headed west, primarily to California, in a desperate search for work as migrant laborers. This tragic exodus was famously chronicled in John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, and documented in Dorothy Alonge's poignant photographs. The federal government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, responded with a series of programs aimed at both relief and long-term solutions. The Soil Conservation Service, now the Natural Resources Conservation Service, was established in 1935 to educate farmers and promote better land management practices, such as contour plowing, terracing, crop rotation, and planting trees as windbreaks. Prairie State's Forestry Project planted millions of trees across the plains to try and anchor the soil. Relief programs provided aid to struggling farm families. The Dust Bowl was a profound shock to the American nation. It highlighted the dangers of unsustainable agricultural practices and the devastating consequences of ecological imbalance. It led to significant and lasting changes in farming techniques and government policies regarding land conservation. The massive migration permanently altered the demographics of states like California. Although the drought began to ease by the early 1940s, and conservation efforts helped some of the land to recover, the memory of the Dust Bowl remains a powerful reminder of environmental vulnerability. Number 2. The Russian Winter that crippled Hitler's war machine. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Nazi Germany, unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest German military operation of World War II, involving around 3 million German soldiers, along with hundreds of thousands more from Allied Axis nations like Romania, Hungary, and Italy. Hitler and his generals confidently expected a rapid victory, believing the Soviet Union would collapse within a few months well before the onset of the notorious Russian winter. Initially, the German Blitzkrieg lightning war tactics proved devastatingly effective. Panzer divisions sliced through Soviet defenses, advancing hundreds of miles in weeks. They encircled and captured vast Soviet armies, taking millions of prisoners. It seemed as though Hitler's prediction of a quick victory might come true. However, the Soviet Union was an immense country. Soviet forces, despite horrific losses, continued to resist fiercely. They adopted a strategy of retreating deep into their territory, trading space for time, and employing scorched earth tactics, destroying anything of value that the advancing Germans might use, just as they had done against Napoleon more than a century earlier. Partisan warfare also began to develop behind German lines, harassing their increasingly stretched supply routes. The German plan began to falter. The sheer vastness of Russia, coupled with poor roads and a different railway gauge that hampered logistics, slowed the German advance. Soviet resistance stiffened, particularly around major cities. Critically, the Germans failed to capture their primary objective, Moscow, before winter set in. And what a winter it was! The winter of 1941 to 1942 arrived early and proved to be exceptionally severe, one of the coldest in decades. Temperatures plunged to bone-chilling levels, minus 30 degrees Celsius 22 F, minus 40 degrees Celsius 40 F, and in some exposed areas even lower. For the German soldiers, it was an unmitigated disaster. They were catastrophically ill-equipped for such extreme cold. Based on the assumption of a short summer campaign, they had not been issued with proper winter clothing, no insulated greatcoats, no warm winter boots, no adequate gloves or headgear. Frostbite became rampant, leading to tens of thousands of cases and countless amputations. Many soldiers simply froze to death in their foxholes on sentry duty or during forced marches. German equipment also failed in the brutal conditions. Lubricants in tanks, trucks, and machine guns froze solid, rendering them inoperable. Engines refused to start. Batteries died. Even rifle bolts sometimes froze. In contrast, Soviet soldiers were generally much better equipped for winter warfare, with warmer clothing and equipment designed to function in extreme cold. They also began to receive fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions, accustomed to harsh winters, who launched powerful counteroffensives. The German offensive on Moscow ground to a halt in early December, bogged down by the freezing weather and desperate Soviet resistance just a few miles from the city's outskirts. Then, the Soviets launched a major counterattack, spearheaded by their winter-hardened troops. The exhausted, freezing, and demoralized Germans were pushed back sometimes hundreds of miles, narrowly avoiding a complete collapse of their front line. Operation Barbarossa had failed in its primary objective of defeating the Soviet Union quickly. The German army, the Wehrmacht, suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, not just from combat, but also from the devastating effects of the cold. It was a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front, which became the main theater of war in Europe. Germany was now mired in a protracted, brutal war of attrition against a resurgent Soviet Union. The arrogant failure to prepare for winter, rooted in the overconfident belief in a swift victory, proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation for Hitler and his war machine. The immense losses of men and materials suffered during that first Russian winter significantly weakened the Wehrmacht and contributed ultimately to Germany's defeat. Number 1. The Great Galveston Storm that reshaped a city. At the dawn of the 20th century, Galveston, Texas, was a city riding a wave of prosperity. Situated on a low-lying barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico, it was a bustling port, a major commercial hub often dubbed the Wall Street of the Southwest. It was one of the wealthiest cities in the United States per capita, with a vibrant cultural life and grand architecture. However, its geography made it vulnerable. The city's highest point was only about 8.7 feet above sea level. Weather forecasting in 1900 was still a developing science. The U.S. Weather Bureau existed, but its ability to predict the track and intensity of hurricanes was limited. There was also an official policy at the time to avoid using the word hurricane in public warnings, and to generally downplay storm threats, partly to prevent panic, and partly due to a rivalry with Cuban meteorologists, who often had more experience with tropical cyclones, but whose warnings were sometimes distrusted or ignored by the U.S. Bureau. On Saturday, September 8, 1900, a powerful hurricane made landfall directly over Galveston. By modern meteorological standards, it is estimated to have been a Category 4 storm, a very intense cyclone. Some warnings had been issued by the local Weather Bureau office, but the true severity of the approaching storm was tragically underestimated. Many Galveston residents, having weathered previous Gulf storms without major incident, were complacent and did not evacuate. The wind was destructive, but the storm surge was the true killer. A colossal wall of water, estimated to be 15.7 feet high, surged over the island. Since the highest elevation in the city was far below this level, virtually the entire city was inundated. Thousands of buildings, homes, businesses, churches, schools were simply obliterated, smashed into kindling by the combined force of wind and waves. The wreckage itself became a deadly hazard, as heavy timbers and debris were carried along by the floodwaters, battering everything in their path. The city was reduced to a horrifying landscape of rubble and ruin. The loss of human life was staggering. The Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900 remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. Estimates of the death toll range from 6,000 to 8,000 people in Galveston alone, with some credible estimates reaching as high as 12,000 when surrounding areas are included. Many bodies were washed out to sea, never to be recovered. Others were buried under tons of debris. The task of finding, identifying, and burying the dead in the aftermath was a gruesome and overwhelming ordeal. In the immediate wake of the storm, Galveston was completely cut off from the mainland. Telegraph lines were down, the railway bridge destroyed. There was no fresh water, no food, and a desperate need for medical aid. Martial law was declared to maintain order and manage the recovery efforts. The sheer scale of the destruction was almost beyond comprehension. Yet, the surviving residents of Galveston resolved to rebuild their city. They knew they could not simply rebuild it as it was. Two monumental engineering projects were undertaken. First, a massive curved concrete seawall was constructed, eventually stretching for over 10 miles along the Gulf front and standing 17 feet high, designed to protect the city from future storm surges. This was an enormous undertaking for its time. Second, and even more astoundingly, the grade elevation of a significant portion of the city behind the seawall was raised. Thousands of buildings were painstakingly jacked up on stilts, and millions of cubic yards of sand fill were dredged from Galveston Bay and pumped underneath them, raising the ground level by as much as 17 feet in some areas. This incredible feat of engineering took many years. Galveston also changed its system of governance. The existing city council was widely seen as having failed during the crisis. In its place, Galveston adopted a commission form of city government, where a small group of elected commissioners, each responsible for specific city departments, managed affairs. This Galveston plan was considered more efficient and was subsequently adopted by many other American cities. While Galveston did rebuild, and the seawall has indeed protected it from subsequent storms, the 1900 hurricane had profound long-term consequences. Investment and shipping commerce began to shift inland to the nearby city of Houston, which was less vulnerable to Gulf storms and was actively developing its own ship channel. Over time, Houston surpassed Galveston to become the region's dominant port and primary economic center. The 1900 storm also served as a grim catalyst for improvements in hurricane forecasting and warning systems in the United States, though that progress was gradual. The memory of that terrible day continues to shake Galveston's identity and serves as a powerful lesson in the forces of nature and human resilience.